Hello, everybody. Today I wanted to start off this review with a brief discussion of a topic that may or may not be of interest to you, and may or may not make you hate me forever. That topic is politics. Over the years, and this has been true for a long time really, I have effectively had two definitions of the word politics, and the two are very violently different in my mind. But every time I try to actually define them, I have difficulty doing so because the source of the real difference between the two from my perspective is the way in which they are received, but tracing that back to the root cause is more difficult. And someone once put forth an idea which was incorrect because, well, I'll get to that in a minute, but there, to summarize from the base from the reaction, there's the type of politics that piss me off, and then there's the type of politics that find absolutely fascinating. The definition I just mentioned that someone put forth was that I find politics that are fictional, aka, when it's fine when someone's being conniving or manipulating or backstabbing or political, which is not just those things, by the way. All cynicism aside, there are politics aside from backstabbing and lying and whatnot. But anyways, there's that form. It's okay with me if that type of politics isn't actually affecting me or the world I live in. I find that to be untrue personally, but it is debatable, I'll admit, because there are forms of politics I do find fascinating within the real world. I'll admit most of those are from an older era, but when I speak of that, I'm talking about when there was still an East and a West, when the Soviet Union was still out and about, when World War II happened, when World War One happened. The plan that I can't think of it. Kaiser Soze put forth, and the myriad web of alliances and treaties and politics he set up. All of that stuff I do find fascinating, and that's real world stuff. Now, obviously, I don't know the full details, and indeed probably never will, because that's how history works in real life. So that's not the difference either. It's not the fact that once I know all the details, because you can in fiction, that it makes the difference. So I don't really know how to properly define the two. And I'll admit I've only talked about that kind of politics because the other kind of politics is hard to define, really, and I try not to call it politics, actually. Usually in the past, I refer to everything I just talked about, political alliances, that sort of thing, as politics, or real politics, rather. And then there's politics, which is what, for example, congressmen do here in the States, in the here and now, which pisses me off. So, take from that what you will. I just wanted to get that out of the way because when I'm referring to politics throughout the entirety of this review, I am referring to the kind that I find interesting. And if I haven't already tipped my hand, let's just say that one of the things I've been doing throughout the Final Fantasy series is really discussing the major themes of the pieces. And politics is the major theme of Final Fantasy XII, taken to its logical extreme, I might add. We have within this game politics at a global level, politics, or at the very least at a continental level. It is debatable, but we don't hear about anything past the area of Evilise that we encounter. So at the very least, I think it is applicable to call it global. We do see politics at a national level, at a country level, because the two are different things. We see politics at the level of individual groups, uh, the resistance movement, for example, or certain companies, or certain interests within those companies. And it boils all the way down to the point where we get down to teams or squads or whatever you want to call it. That's obviously not a good example for something that isn't military, but that general size. And then all the way back down to the individual politics of people versus people. Because politics, real politics, again, like I said, forevermore, I'm referring to the kind that interests me, is something that is true here in real life all the way down to an individual level. There's a reason why there are office politics, for lack of a better term, at some place called McDonald's. Now, obviously you know what McDonald's is. My point is that even some place that is consisting of at the most a few dozen individuals, most of whom don't see the others on a regular basis, and only interact with each other because they kind of have to, because they're there for the paycheck. Obviously, there are exceptions. I don't want to feel like I'm stereotyping. I could name any small business of any type, fast food or otherwise, and this would still be applicable. But even in that level, there is a degree of politics involved, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be, obviously, but then again, as I've said many times, anything can be a bad thing when taken to an extreme. And if I were really, it just occurred to me, literally just right now, occurred to me that I think that is why that is the difference in the two politics things I was talking about earlier. The thing that the people are doing that piss me off nowadays in the news and media, in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, on the state level, in the judicial system, is taken to an extreme. And if I haven't made it clear yet, I really don't care for extremes in either direction. And since so many of those politicians go one direction or another, sometimes both, depending on the point in their career, that may be it. That's just a theory. I apologize. I didn't mean to segue like that. Let's move on. Final Fantasy XII really is about the political nature of human life. Now, I say that because obviously there are a lot more than humans within this setting, but sentient life really is what it boils down to. And their interactions one with another. In other words, it is ultimately a very social, or at least the theme of the game is a very social one, and how we react with one another, and how we interact, how we present ourselves based on who we're with, that kind of thing, Very pervasive throughout the whole thing. Let me give you a direct example of something I find fascinating about the politics of Final Fantasy XII. The nation, the city-state, really, of Bujerba is one that has independence, okay? However, they are effectively the property of the Arcadian Empire because the Arcadian Empire, while it has no military presence, nor indeed does it need one, nevertheless has exerted enough political and economic pressure on the city-state to get the best magicite veins and to have preferential treatment and the ability to, as we see in the game, basically walk in and do what they want because Bujerba basically exists at the behest or at the leniency of the Arcadian Empire, right? Now the funny thing is, this works best for both individuals or both entities here, because Bujerba does get to maintain its own self. It is effectively a puppet state, really, when it comes down to it, because even though they have no direct ties to Arcadia, they are not under Arcadian rule. The Arcadians, nevertheless, those of import and those in authority, can show up and basically do whatever they want, within reason, of course. Obviously, such an official could not do anything even within Arcadia's own borders, but you get my point. They do effectively have the benefits of rule without having to actually govern the place. So Arcadia doesn't have to... It's expensive having a garrison, basically. I know that's the sort of thing that usually isn't covered in video game, but FF12 does cover this, at least in brief. It is expensive to garrison an area. It is expensive to maintain a continuous military presence in an area, and there has to be a justifiable reason for that. If you can avoid doing so through political and economic pressure, so much the better. Those troops can be sent elsewhere or simply not sent at all. You don't have to have that particular division to exist, because it's not necessary. And again, they already get the economic benefit of the island, of getting the best of the magicite veins that come out. So, really, everything they would want from actually conquering Bujerba is already theirs. The only way in which Bujerba is not a part of Arcadia is in name, if you see what I'm going here, on paper, if you will. That is politics in a nutshell, and at least on a large scale, on a scale of countries and nations. That is the way, and that there are so many examples of that throughout this game. One of the major plot points throughout the game, sorry for skipping ahead a little bit here, is whether or not the Princess Ashe should declare Dalmasca free, right? Declare their independence. What's interesting about this is she's not actually saying we should fight back and push the Arcadians out, who have a garrison in Rabanastre and within Dalmasca, but simply declaring that we are free on the political forum, if you understand what I'm saying here, and in so doing, basically open up the game again. If you can think of this as like a chessboard, it's all of a sudden like, oh, sorry, we've started the game over again and we've reset it to this position. Now the catch is, the reason she does not do that so early on is because she needs some kind of oomph behind her, either literal, as in some kind of power, which much of the game is what they decide on. They need some literal power, or for a while they're discussing if they need some kind of political clout, something that is not literal, not the ability to defend her nation, but the ability to do so in a diplomatic sense. And all of this probably doesn't make a sense to some of my audience. I'm not trying to sell you short. I'm just saying, I know a lot of people who don't like to get into this sort of political thing, and I'm fine with that. I find this sort of thing fascinating. Obviously, with the general level of enthusiasm I'm displaying here, I'm actually kind of stuttering over my words because I find this sort of thing absolutely fascinating. And again, in real life and in fiction, especially when it's done well. And let's be honest, the Evil East team tends to do this sort of political fiction extremely well. One other thing I want to talk about really quick here at the start is Final Fantasy Tactics. Not Advance, not Tactics Advance, not Tactics Advance 2, the original Final Fantasy Tactics. In my opinion, that game has the best plot of any game ever made. I mean that sincerely. While I think FF6 has a better story, and I'll define what that means later when we get to Half-Life, which is next, by the way, for anyone who's wondering. But while I think FF6 and certain other games indeed have a better story, the specific plot of Final Fantasy Tactics was the most well-written, most in-depth, most beautifully constructed thing I've ever seen in a video game. It was a marvel. It was wonderfully complex and at the same time so immensely thematic. It was almost theatrical in its presentation. I loved it, especially, by the way, in the PSP version. If you have played FFT and liked it at all, I strongly recommend, if you have the capacity to get a hold of the PSP version, the modifications to the dialogue alone and the improvement of the quality of the translation alone is worth the price of admission, in my opinion. But that game was all about that sort of thing. And it has its own structure, and I'm not going to talk about that here. I still am not sure if I'm going to review Final Fantasy Tactics. I'm not going to do it in the FF series, obviously, since I already kind of gave that away. But I'll debate that one later. Let's move on, though. Final Fantasy XII's overall structure does have a flaw. I'm going to go and get this out pretty early on here, too. One of the reasons... okay. I have seen two major reasons why people tend to not like this game. One is that it was too much of a branch out. One of the things that the new team... Excuse me. Goodness, I just got something caught in my throat. Out of nowhere. Pardon me. One of the things that the new team has done ever since FF7 is try to branch out every now and again. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. The most obvious examples are the ones that are the least popular, FF8 and 10.2. 12 is probably next up on that list, because 12 really did try to branch out. And it's also worth noting that only a little bit of the new team was involved. I mean, obviously they were involved, don't mistake me. And if you look at the credits, you can verify or deny as however you wish. But overall, this was not a baby of the Final Fantasy team. In fact, this was arguably the last time the Final Fantasy team would work on a single project. And even then it was with the Evilist team as well. But they really tried to branch out and do something new, not just in terms of storytelling, but in terms of gameplay, in terms of combat mechanics, in terms of the way the game was presented. It's often been described as a single-player MMO, and that's a fairly apt description, especially given the way the side quests are presented, and the overall, the way that... I'm trying to think of a good way to put this. Let's just put it this way. There is no such thing as an overworld map in FF12, okay? Now, obviously, that hasn't been true since 9, actually. But my point is, that distinction by itself is significant. Even FF10 arguably had something of an overworld map with the airship. That's debatable, I'll admit, and I'm not going to go into that. But FF12 completely abandoned the idea. You had a map, so you had a general idea of what led to where, but it was just a map, just like any other map in an MMO. You see where I'm going with this? If you don't, I apologize, because I'm a little stuttery today because I just spent the last several hours talking. I just finished a D&D session. Awesome session, by the way. I'll get to that later. The point is, the whole presentation of the game was very much the third-person perspective. You are playing an MMO. Just everything about it. I don't know how to describe it. I apologize. I'm sorry. I don't know how to go into details. But the overall presentation was designed to feel like an MMO. It was done on purpose. It was done to look for that kind of niche. And even though there was absolutely zero multiplayer within this game, that feeling put off a lot of people, and I don't blame them. And like I said, the story of FF12 was much more about the politics. The politics of the nations, the politics of the societies. That's another form of politics I forgot to mention earlier. Societal politics, cultural politics, It was all over the place. It was the entirety of the story of FF12 is immersed with this theme, and it wasn't until the very end that it started getting to something more classically FF. Now, um, my actual problem with this game is neither of these things. The biggest flaw to Final Fantasy XII, in my opinion, is the fact that it started petering out towards the end. Now, this is a flaw in a lot of games in the more modern era, and I, I'm not even going to begin to name some. There are so many games where they kind of had to rush things towards the end because they were running out of time or budget or whatever. There was something that made the team have to hurry up towards the end, and it usually is palpable as you're playing through the game. It's such a shame, really, because I think Final Fantasy XII could have been a lot better if they hadn't. But right about the time you first go to Giravegan, I replayed Final Fantasy XII no more than 6 months ago. I think it was actually less than that, fairly recently. And as I was replaying it, I was keeping things in mind for this review, and it became so apparent the structure of the game. I've talked before about flow and about pacing. I'll talk about this more when I get to Half-Life again, because it'll be very relevant to that game. But in Final Fantasy XII, in summary, the pacing was very well designed. It was very well crafted, let's put it in those terms. And virtually every major, or in some cases minor, segment that included gameplay would then include story and exposition. And when I say story, in brief, story refers to everything across the gamut that involves everything that isn't actually shooting things, if you understand what I mean. You know, characterization, history, setting, the actual plot, any subplots, that kind of thing, right? So it would be like action information, action information. And for those of you who, it was a good balance between the two. If you liked one or the other, generally you would have enough of that one that putting up with the other one wasn't a big deal. Then you go to Giravegan, and that pattern stops just like that, out of absolutely nowhere. And all of a sudden, you do have a few cutscenes, but these cutscenes involve literally less than 3 lines of dialogue, so they don't actually count. Almost every single one of these sets up a boss fight, too, just to further emphasize. So you go through what I actually counted at the time, I don't recall now, but a fairly large number of dungeons, a fairly large number of boss fights, a huge section of the game, in terms of hours, mind you, with no exposition, no story, no nothing. And in my opinion, that was one of the biggest. That is a failing, because all of a sudden, all I have is combat, and the story just kind of stops as I peruse through these things. Now, the argument could be made that that makes sense given the circumstances, but it is clear based on the way it's presented that this was not something that was done deliberately per se. This was a conceit because they were running out of time. And from that point on, the whole game follows that model. You get like I think a grand total of 2 additional cutscenes of real story and exposition. One when you get back from Garavegan, and one immediately following the Pharaoh's Lighthouse. And after that, it's just right to the finale, and then the final battle, and you're done. The whole thing really, it's such a shame. I don't want to. I'm not blaming the game, and I'm not blaming the team. Let's make that clear, okay? In fact, I sympathize a great deal. But it is such a shame because there was so much potential there, in my opinion, to keep going. Of course, that would make the game much longer, and it's already a very long game, but let's move on. Final Fantasy XII's story revolves around. You know what? Hang on, let me just think about this, because I have a lot of notes here, and I was debating where to go to next. Because obviously I've been talking about the game as a whole, and I usually try to do that before I get down to specifics. One of the things I really did enjoy about the game was it bothered to show that while certain profilings, certain prejudices were founded, had good reason to exist, there were exceptions. A good example of this is with the Arcadian Imperials. Arcadian. You encounter a few Imperials who are uppity, who are arrogant, who are your stereotypical abusive bully type personality that joins the military in order to push people around. And you see a fair amount of these not only in Rabanastre but in the rest of the Empire in general. That is a thing that happens. You also see several corrupt officials, several of the judges, I think statistically most of the judges, as well as several of the senators. Debatably, we don't know that much about them. You know, Vane himself, of course, is a prime example. Blah, 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 blah. There are several people who are clearly corrupt, not good people within the Arcadian Empire. And yet we also see plenty of people who are perfectly well-meaning, who genuinely have a sense of honor and decency, who want to do things the right way, or simply do things right. Again, at all levels. We see that on the level of the individual soldier or citizens of the empire. We also see that on the level of people who are in power, such as two of the judges, and debatable, but I still think Zargaboth counts in that. And several of the other elected officials, whose names I can't think of, I apologize right now. But my favorite example of all, if you'll allow me to diverge just for a second, there is a single soldier in Rabanastra. He gives one of the side missions, okay? Which I'll discuss that next. He, in this one soldier, he's just a grunt, basically. I don't even know the actual military equivalent in the States, but whatever. The equivalent of just your basic, I am a trooper, I have no rank, I hold a weapon kind of guy, right? This guy encountered or was made aware of a monster, which is just out of the range of the city, but it's close enough that it actually poses a threat to the city and the caravans going in and without. He was bothered by this, okay? He took this to his commanding officer. Now, his commanding officer said, we don't know, because we never actually see this conversation, nor the commanding officer, him or herself, whether or not that person was simply, again, corrupt, someone who was an evil individual, whether lightly or majorly. We don't know if they were simply uncaring. We don't know if they didn't. They were being obstinate, either because of bureaucratic or economic reasons. We don't know. What we do know, absolutely, is this individual, this plain old grunt, had a pretty good heart and was a decent person, because he then goes out of his way to pay out of his pocket. No actual official funds here, just out of his paycheck. He pays for a hunt group. The bounty. He pays for a bounty on this monster, and you, the party, then takes it and goes out and defeats it. And after you do so, while he regrets having to pay for this, he's like, "Oh, this is gonna suck for the next month or two." He nevertheless says it was worth it. I liked that a lot. In fact, I loved that. That is the thing I think Final Fantasy XII does best. And it's something I haven't seen since FF9. FF9 and FF12 both did this very well. They made it feel like you were in a world. They're the closest, I should say. Obviously, they're not perfect, but they are the closest games in the FF series, in my opinion, that make you feel like you're actually part of a living, breathing world. And there are so many NPCs you can talk to. There are so many NPCs that say different things at different times. There's so much background information you can gather. You get little lore tidbits just from defeating enemies, and if you defeat a sufficient amount, you either get another lore tidbit, which goes into the setting, or gives you some hint as to the crafting system. There is so much to explore and so much to take in and envelop you within the setting of Ivalice. It was brilliantly done. And I loved those little tidbits. They're all little, they're all small, they're all subtle, and they're everywhere. And they're totally optional, which is fantastic. Obviously, I tend to go through and enjoy every single one of them, even on replays, because I like that sort of thing. But I also am very firmly in favor of it being optional, because some people don't. Or some people just want to enjoy going through, or some people just want to enjoy playing, or whatever. And so they don't have to. Very well done, very well executed, and definite props to the team for that. Now, I said I'd talk about the hunt system next. That is one of the more interesting, if almost cynical, ways of doing a side mission hub that I've seen. Now, obviously, there are a few other side quests in addition to the hunt, but statistically speaking, the hunts are like 90% of all the side quests throughout the entire game. They all follow the same basic format. You get a bill about some creature, you go talk to someone, and this is the part I like, you get a little bit, usually just a tiny little bit of lore, of information. Why are you going after this thing? For what purpose did this person place this bill, this bounty? You know, maybe some information about the creature itself. Something like that. You get something, and then you go off and defeat it. The hunts are all what I call optionals. That is to say, they are harder than standard content, and well, obviously they're optional. You don't have to actually go fight them. The rewards are usually quite good. The exp is usually quite good, and you get some advancement of the story and the setting as well. So hey, benefit all around. And then you come back and usually you get another little tidbit because you turn it into the person, not the board, and there you go. It's a very formulaic thing. Virtually every hunt follows the same formula, but I like the fact that they actually made it make sense in lore, if you know what I mean. It's not, you, the player, are picking up a bounty for something. There is a system of a clan, Curio? I suddenly can't think of the name of it. Whatever. Um, that this one Moogle, whose name I also can't think of right now, founded specifically to service the system in lore, in setting, to go after bounties and help do this thing. And he actually had his own reasons for doing so, even though it is overall probably what you would consider a beneficial addendum to the setting and to the culture and to the world. He did so because he wanted to eventually get someone who was so good at hunting, who had ranked up past anything and everything that he knew, in order to take on Yzmat, which is the creature that killed his master. And I like that. I like the fact that the whole thing makes sense from a gameplay perspective and from a lore perspective. If you've been watching my D&D reviews at all, you know I'm very big on making those two things mesh as much as possible. So I really like the way they presented that, and it is worth noting that on my most recent playthrough, I realized how difficult those hunts were because I'd forgotten. Back in the day, what I'd done is I had leveled quite a bit and then gone and done the hunts, and I just kind of paused the story basically and did every hunt I could, which was quite a few, leveling as I go and becoming ridiculously overpowered for the point I was in the actual plot because I was doing all the optional stuff first. On my replay through, I'm like, all right, I'm going to go do the hunts first thing, and got destroyed. I was like, oh, right, they're hard. Or at least they're harder than, everything else you fight at that point. So I was like, okay, right, let's try this again. I really enjoyed that system, though. Now, let's go ahead and move on here. I don't know what else to add as an overall sense to this game. The... One of the things I do like about the game, and this is more an Evil East thing than it is Final Fantasy XII specifically, if I were to ever imagine a Final Fantasy being reimagined in several ways, this is probably a good way to do so. Obviously, when you reimagine something, you can go all sort of different directions with it, and they can be good, or great, or terrible, or horrible, or fantastic, anywhere along the gamut. But I think if you were to take, like, say, Final Fantasy and do a reimagining, I do stress reimagining specifically. There is a difference between a reimagining and a reboot, and the difference which should be obvious. I'm not even going to bore you with that because everyone out there is intelligent enough to know that. But I could see Final Fantasy XII in the way it presents the FF formula and the species and the specifics of the things that make a Final Fantasy as a reimagining of Final Fantasy. And whether that's a net positive or net negative is kind of up to the individual, because that's how it always works. Whether or not you specifically like the way this has been portrayed in this particular iteration. However, I do think that this was a well-done way of doing it, and it did engage my imagination, if you know what I mean. It did actually make me think, oh, that's interesting, or oh, that's a way to present it. I like that. I especially like the way they dealt with the Moogles, just to use a specific example. I think that was actually really cool, all things considered, and admittedly was a bit of an inspiration for one of the races in my D&D campaign I'm running right now. But let's not get into that. Let's see, what else we got here. There are two other things, other than the big main ones I just mentioned at the beginning of this review, that I imagine some people think of as negatives to this game. The first is the Gambits. I've heard a lot of jokes about the Gambits, but as far as actual opinions, I have heard people say it is incredibly stupid, just as much as I've heard people say it is incredibly awesome. Where do I sit on that? I was recently debating with a friend of mine, if you'll forgive me for the tangent, whether or not to continue being as openly honest as I am willing to be on these reviews, on these ruminations, on these videos I do, and whether or not to continue just kind of being me, basically. Now, obviously, I do try to do that in general, but I have a little voice in the back of my head that always says, well, someone might take offense to that, or, well, someone might disagree with you on that, or whatever. And while I don't mind disagreements as long as they're done in what I call the right way, which is to say, if you disagree and you say, hey, Arshanga, I disagree with you, and here's why, I'm like, oh, okay. But every now and again I get people who are just like, oh, you're an idiot, or oh, God, you're a moron, and stuff like that. And so I always have that voice in the back of my head that's like, maybe you shouldn't say that, because someone's just going to say, oh, you're a moron. But I am going to try and be as honest as I can. I like the Gambit system. I genuinely do. I really do. I like that type of scripting AI within a game that is basically a real-time action piece. Dragon Age would actually be a pretty good example of something else where you could do something very similar. I can't actually think of many other examples off the top of my head. I think there's a couple. But it's scripting is really what it is. The Gambits, the whatever's, it's all a form of scripting. Now, speaking as someone who is pretty good at coding, obviously that makes a degree of sense to me that I shouldn't have to elaborate on. But even ignoring that, I like the fact that I don't have to micromanage if I don't want to. I can put 15 if-then statements over on them and be like, here, do this. And I like that sort of planning. I have spoken in the past about the difference between tactics, which is in the moment, and strategy, which is prepping, basically. Obviously, that's not the actual difference between tactics and strategy, but you get the point, right? Like, for example, Pokemon is generally speaking, is more about planning and setting up your team and setting up your abilities and your moveset and whatever items they've equipped and their EVs and their IVs such that they are prepared for just about any situation. At that point, the tactics are relatively simple because you prepared. You follow me? I'm not saying there's anything non-tactical about it. I'm just saying that the primary engagement there is the prep. The same goes with Final Fantasy XII. I need to anticipate every possible situation I can think of with these gambits, and especially given the area I'm at, and Lord knows, especially early on when you don't have the full thing of gambits, you need to think, okay, well now I'm here, and now let's switch this with this, and let's do this. Oh, but I don't have one for that, so I'll have to do that thing manually, but that's okay, I'll just have to remember to do it, It's about the prep. And thus, when you get it prepped, when you get it designed, when you have your fantastic contraption set up and you hit go, seeing it move smoothly, which it doesn't always do, admittedly, is enjoyable to me. And watching my teams become this well-oiled machine is awesome. Now, of course, again, you have to refine it to that point, or at least I did. Whoops, I should fix this, or this doesn't work that way, and blah, blah, blah. And I discovered tricks as I went on, and things like that, things that would function in different ways than I actually thought they would initially, blah, blah, blah. But I enjoyed that. And if you don't, this is the important part in my opinion. And this is one of the reasons why I genuinely don't understand most of the complaining about the system. You don't have to use it. There is literally an option, on the fly no less, to turn gambits off. And if you feel like turning them back on, you can do that too. You can play the entire game manually if you really want to. And there's even a pause button to, give orders if you want to pause for a second in this real-time environment, and then be like, okay, go. I don't understand if it is optional, why then people have such derision for it. I suppose maybe because it exists at all, and there's a degree of cynicism involved with that, the game playing itself, that sort of thing. But in my personal opinion, the fact that it is optional means that any complaints about it cannot be taken too seriously. I mean, obviously you can complain about it because you don't like it, but you can't say that makes the game worse because it doesn't, because you can turn that option off. Do you see where I'm coming with this? I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm not trying to upset anyone. I'm just trying to understand, because to me that makes no sense, because it's optional. This is one of the reasons I'm so in favor of things that are optional, because, for example, if I was very against the Gambit system, let's just reverse my opinion. Let's say I hate the Gambit system, right? One of the first things I would do as soon as they tell you in the little tutorial right after you get Balthier and Fran in the sewers was turn those gambits off. It's like, oh god, I don't want to use those damn things. There we go. And then I'd play the rest of the game and enjoy it, because the thing that annoys me is now gone. So that's my perspective on it. The other thing is the level of sheer customization. Now, I've talked about this throughout all of the Final Fantasy reviews I've done, basically from the beginning up until now. And for those of you who have not watched the whole series, allow me to elaborate very quickly. True customization and completely fixed leveling path are the two extremes here, okay? And the Final Fantasy series has been all around this gamut, but it has never been to true customization all the way to the furthest extreme until this game, Final Fantasy XII. This is the one. Even FF10, which is like a step this closer, still had some level of restriction, and indeed, most of the actual customization in branching out throughout the spheres was basically optional. You don't have to go across over to Auron's grid and then down to Riku's or whatever. You don't have to. Final Fantasy VII is actually a bit closer because, you've got the different weapon types and you've got the limit breaks and stuff like that, and so forth and so on. And as I've discussed before, FF6 is basically in the middle. Inch. Which is funny because FF9 is actually over here, but anyways, moving on. The point I'm getting at is FF12 is true customization. Now, one of the things I mentioned early on is that I prefer a blend of the two. And I'll admit, I do think it is a little bit of a negative in Final Fantasy XII that you have total customization. But as I mentioned earlier in my earlier reviews, that there is a true benefit to having this type of customization, and that is, I can bring the characters I want, not the classes I want. I don't have to bring Fran because she's blah, whatever, a Dragoon, let's just assume, because she looks like one. I don't have to bring Fran because she's a Dragoon. I don't have to bring Balthier because he's an archer. I can bring whatever characters I want in my team for whatever reason, and it's generally considered aesthetic, and I'll get to that in just a second. Um, because it basically doesn't matter. So I can set up any member of my team in any way I feel like. You understand where I'm coming with this? And that is basically a benefit. The reason I say it is a general negative as well is, like I said, the difference is actually totally aesthetic. Really, it is. Because in most Final Fantasies and most RPGs in general, the people you have in your party determines who says what during the cutscenes. This goes back quite a ways in terms of these games, but this has been true for quite a while. Is the point I'm trying to get across? A good example of this in extreme would be Chrono Trigger. After the point at which you can swap party members at will, who is in your party will determine what dialogue you get during the cutscenes. Right? That's one of the reasons New Game Plus was so fun in that game, because you could see, okay, now let's see what Frog and Isla says for the rest of the game. But in FF12, it doesn't matter. Who you have in your party determines who you see in any combat area, basically. Anything that is in the MMO style, really. Because whenever you're in town, you see Vaughn, or whoever your main character happens to be, usually Vaughn. And whenever you're in a cutscene, it's fully rendered. There is no such thing as a non-rendered cutscene in this game. Well, okay, yes, there is, but you get my point. There is no such thing as, because you have Balthier in your party, he will say something, whereas instead of, if you had Ash in your party, she would say something. No, no, no. If anyone was going to say something in any cutscene, they say it. Now, you could say, again, that is a benefit. In my opinion, that goes too far, because that does absolutely trivialize who your party members are. At that point, in my frank opinion, as far as a gameplay mechanic, if you really wanted that sort of thing, why not just give us 3 party members and be done with it? Have the rest be NPCs who tag along. They do this in FF12, mind you. They do have the guest member mechanic. So that is something they could have done. Now, I don't want to sound too much like I'm complaining, because this is a minor point. It really is. But this is why it is I prefer some level of balance between the two. Now, let's see, what else we got here? Oh, one other thing. I know some people out there are going to be like, well, you don't have true customization. I mean, you still can pick... Well, okay. Let me actually rewind a bit here. One of the real problems from a developer's perspective, when you and for those of you out there who have actually worked on your own works with regards to mechanics or the actual balancing thereof, and I know there's at least some of you out there, and I have of course done so myself on several occasions now, including recently. One of the problems is that if you want some level of customization within your system, if you want the players to have some ability to say, well, I want to be specialized in big guns, or I want to be specialized in a katana, or whatever. This is generalized, obviously. Finding a balance between giving the player that customization option and forcing it on them is very difficult to do. There are 2 ways to really look at this, the MMO perspective and the Final Fantasy XII perspective. And I say that because FF12 is probably the best example I can think of this method. In an MMO, in general, and this is true for all MMOs, I'm not just talking about something like WoW, for example. This has been true since the beginning. There's generally one type of spec that is going to be superior in whatever format it needs to be, in terms of doing damage output, in terms of being capable of taking hits, in terms of healing, whatever. Even in the games before they actually had the triad, like Asheron's Call, there were some builds that were simply considered superior for their ability to solo, or for their ability to do significant output of damage within a short period of time to certain types of mobs, right? There is such a thing as an optimal build. This is just reality. This is life. The problem is when you have something like an optimal build, anybody who's trying to do the super hard stuff is going to basically do the optimal build, and at that point they don't have the availability of customization. And B, when you are designing the difficulty of that stuff, you have to assume they're using the optimal build. You have to assume they're using the system to its furthest extent, even if they're not, which again by itself forces them to it. It's a cycle. You have to assume they're assuming you're assuming. You understand where I'm going with this? And so at that point, well, even if you have customization, at a certain level you don't. And of course you could say, well, you don't have to be perfectly optimized, and you're right, you don't, unless if you're not doing the super hard stuff. But there is still a degree of social pressure there to, why aren't you this build? Why aren't you the 5/16/36 or whatever? That's just a number I made up off the top of my head. Why aren't you doing this setup? Why aren't you using this stats? there is a degree of pressure involved in that. Now, of course, that's up to the individuals to either reject or cave into or think on their own right or whatever, but there are still going to be people who are either because they want to be doing better or because they don't want to be seen as doing worse, will then go ahead and use the optimal build. And there you go, boom, customization gone. Now, the real problem here is there's not really a lot of options around that, not without getting into obscene levels of complexity, which is why most games don't do that at all. MMOs, I should say. Then there's the single-player aspect, the FF12 aspect, as I mentioned earlier. We have this whole grid, and you can go any direction you want in it, and while there's still a sort of progression, the stuff over on this side is cheaper and the stuff over on this side is more expensive, nevertheless, if you felt like it, you could go straight for the most expensive stuff and go up here, and you could go straight over here, and you could customize it however you want. But again, we have that problem of, in FF12, it's not so much about customization as it is about simply maxing out the board. At a certain point in the game, really that's what it comes down to. You don't actually want to do that. You don't actually want to, I want this character to be this spec, I want this character to have all my green magic, and I want this character to be using bows. At some point in the time, you're just going to try and max out the board to the best of your ability. And the equipment side of thing, which I could hear some of you arguing already, ultimately, more comes down to what equipment you have rather than the equipment you want to specialize in. For example, let's say you get a really nice polearm that's better than, or not polearm, the bow thing, BO for, as in a bow. And there's actually a term for those. I can't think of it right now. Whatever. And you really want to use that, and it happens to be right next to one of the weapon slots he already has. So you say, learn. There's 30 points burnt, 30 license points, and there you go. He can now equip that. Now you could, at that point, if you get what I'm saying, your choice isn't, do I have a bow character? Your choice is, which character do I spend the extra points on to equip this bow on? And let's say you get 2 bows. Okay, well now we'll choose which 2 characters. You get where I'm going with this. Final Fantasy XII's true customization feels more mandatory than not. I'll admit that it truly isn't. You can defeat the game without maxing out the board, but you cannot do all the optional stuff without maxing out the board. And that's basically, in the single-player reflection, exactly what I just said about the MMOs. You don't have to max out the board. You don't have to fill out everything. But if you want to do everything, then yes, you do. And now let's make things clear. I know there's challenges in not doing so. Lord knows I know about challenges in the Final Fantasy series and in video games in general. So I know there's the no license challenge or the limited license challenge. But for a normal player who's just sitting down to play a game that he wants to enjoy the story in and see the optional content on, it's no longer optional. Obviously the content is optional, but there's no longer customization there. At that point, it's just, what do you want now? Not what are you going to build your character as. Now this is not truly a complaint. Let's make this clear. All it is, effectively, is an alternate method of leveling when you pull it down to that system. And you do have a choice of to what you level in what order, and I like that. But it is no longer customization, if you follow where I'm going with here. And that's why true all of this is a way of me trying to explain why it is, I think, going to the extreme of FF12's true customization was overall not a good idea. I think they should have reined it in some. I think they should have used a different system or a similar system or something. Some variation. No, I'm not going to give any examples because that would take too long. I have thought about this, of course, because it's me. Now, what else have we got? Peter, CGI. I have to give props to the CGI of this game, by the way. I know that's not something I comment on often, since graphics, while I think aesthetics are important, graphics are something that I'm a lot more lenient on. I'm someone who still finds the CGI cutscenes of StarCraft, the first one, mostly Brood War, actually, admittedly. Brood War had much better ones, but StarCraft as well. I find those CGI cutscenes awesome. Not because they look any good. In fact, you look back at them and they look terrible. But aesthetically, they were very well done. They were very well directed. The sound quality was fantastic. They were very theatrical. They were very, they were chilling. They were well done. But I have to give props to Final Fantasy XII for having some absolutely stunning CGI. And it's saying something when even I have to comment on it. My God. Even nowadays, even going back to the game, just this last year, I was still very impressed by the CGI in this game, and they really went out of their way to try and make it as epic as possible. I'm going to use that word specifically, because that's the feel I got the impression they were going for. A lot of people have commented on the Star Wars allegories between Final Fantasy XII and Star Wars. Um, and I think that's actually very accurate. I don't know if it's true or not. I have never bothered to look into that myself. But the overall feel is very much in that direction. The grand space opera type of thing. Although obviously it's not in space, but the way they do airships, the way they have the massive sprawling cities that are massively detailed and have so many different things. The different environments you see. You see so many different places within this game that vary wildly from one from another and really give you an experience of a diverse area, diverse culture, diverse environment. Very well done. I do have to give props to their CGI department, to their directors, to their to their designers. The massive number of people involved in all of that for using the CGI in the way that CGI should be used, in my opinion, which is to accent and add to the game, movie, or TV show, rather than in place of. If I might diverge for just a second. This is a topic I've debated with my friends often. It is my opinion that excessive CGI is a bad thing when it's done in place of, rather than in service of, whatever it is you're working on. If I might use a direct example, I was one of those people who was not particularly opposed to the addition of CGI within the re-release of the original Star Wars trilogy. I thought some of it got a little silly, but one of the things I really liked was the redoing of the space battles because they were done properly, in my opinion, and it really got across the point of the battles better than. Well, let's be honest. The fact that you could see the guys moving like this because they were obviously, two models that were literally glued together on a thing, I thought that was a net positive because the CGI was being used to accent and to add to, rather than in place of, such as say the Phantom Menace, which I'm going to point out specifically. Although, actually, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm going to point to Attack of the Clones because that's the one that, in my opinion, leaned on CGI the worst. In place of in place of the story, in place of the setting, in place of actually adding anything to it. It was just there to look flashy, and it didn't. With very few exceptions, it didn't actually add anything to the story, to the movie. It was there for its own sake. I could point another example, but I don't like to point that one out because a lot of people take offense at that. But let's just move on. The whole point I'm trying to get across here is that I think Final Fantasy XII used its CGI and indeed its graphics in general, which I think were very aesthetically pleasing, in service of the game, in service of the story, in service of the setting, and I think it worked very well. Alright, let's move on to characters, shall we? Vaughn. Now there's a controversial character. Now I've been on record that saying that I didn't like Tidus because he was irritating, and I didn't like Hope because I wanted to shove his jaw back into his... Sorry, I don't like Hope. Vaughn kind of half irritated me, and I half liked him as a character. Does that make any sense? Basically, I think Vaughn was a tool that they used sometimes as a literary tool properly, and the other times he was there because I don't know why, because that's just kind of where they were going with that at that time in Final Fantasy's history. But one thing I will give Vaughn is that he was a very effective viewpoint character. This is something that they did previously in Final Fantasy X with Tidus. They had a character who knew virtually nothing about everything that was going on, and so as a character has this exposition given to them, as a character has these things explained to them, thus too does the audience. And some people think that's lazy storytelling. I don't personally agree, but it is a very specific choice in storytelling style. It is a way to show someone. It is a way to do exposition without being stupid about it. Truly bad exposition would be, for example, Ash. No, no. Let's take. Oh yeah, let's go with that. Ash telling Bosch. As you know, Bosch, you were imprisoned several years ago for such and such and such and such. And Bosch says, well, yes, of course, Ash. And you, of course, know that your prince was let off to fight against the Arcadian military and died in combat. And Ash is like, well, of course I know that. And then I attempted to, fake my own suicide. Bad exposition, and this is something that will come up as I continuing my Voyager reviews, is when two people are expositing in a way that is very clearly, they might as well just turn to the camera, is really what it comes down to. They might as well just turn to the camera right now, like I'm doing right now, and being like, okay, listen, here's some exposition, blah, 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 okay. True exposition, for a writer who has some talent, is a way that makes sense within the setting, not just for the viewpoint, for you out there, the viewer. That's why some people think the viewpoint character is cheating, because they are effectively getting the exposition directly to the viewer, but they are in fact doing so in a way that makes sense, even though it's only like one step removed, really, when it comes down to it. I don't have a problem with it. That comes down to personal opinion, though. I just thought I'd mention it because that is basically what Vaughn is when it comes down to it. There is one other thing I do like about Vaughn, though, within the story, and that is the fact that it does it. A question has been levied on several occasions. Why does he stay with the party for so long? While there's obvious in-character lore reasons, which I won't go into, from a literary perspective, one of the biggest reasons I think Vaughn stayed with the party is because he was an excellent um, third party, if you understand what I mean. Third party perspective. It is so easy for someone who is as torn up as Ash, which I'll get to later. I'll talk about her last, actually. And someone who is guilt-ridden as Bosch, and someone who has so many layers and problems as Balthier does, and who is as alien as Fron is. If all these characters, Vaughn was an excellent way in character, in lore, in story, for these characters to have another perspective to help them keep grounded, to help them stay where they were. And it is worth noting that it is Vaughn who is the one who finally forgives Gabranth for killing his brother. Because he doesn't actually forgive him, I shouldn't say that. But he does give a wonderful speech in that moment. And that speech and his acceptance of that is, in my opinion, the impetus that truly has Ash break from the path she'd been on. She'd already been leaning away, don't mistake me. I don't think Vaughn could have done it on his own. But that's, I think, properly done. Ash was already having doubts about the path she was on, and she was already having some severe issues with the overall circumstances. And then she sees a kid whose life was destroyed by the man he's standing in front of, refusing to take his vengeance, refusing to, in his own words, debase himself like that. And that was a beautiful thing for Ash to look at and pull herself out of her own perspective so that she could be like, oh, and decide on her furthering course of action. I liked that. I think that was very appropriate. I have to be honest, though, Vaughn irritated the hell out of me on more than one occasion. He really did. And it's basically every time he tried to act like he was more experienced or more adult or more cool than he actually was. When Vaughn was being himself, he was fine, in my opinion. Not my favorite character, but, you know. But every time he tried to be like, oh, well, you know. Anyways. Now, Penelo. One thing I do have to say is a positive nature, maybe. This is very debatable. Is that Penelo was portrayed as a strong female character, which I think video games in general, no, media in general, tends to have some problems with. And so I tend to enjoy it when I see a strong female character, someone who doesn't have to be, you know, a damsel in distress. Now, any of you out there who have played Final Fantasy XII are immediately wondering, oh, well, I mean, why are you saying that? Because she was a damsel in distress more than once. To which I respond, yeah, that's why I said maybe. The problem with Penelo is they tried to portray her as this strong female character and then immediately sabotaged their own efforts by having her be the damsel in distress, the person who has to be rescued. And the funny thing is, first she had to be rescued from, you know, the villains, and then she had to be rescued from base machinations by, oh shoot, I can't think of his name, the kid. He's one of the major characters. He's not a player character, but he's Vane's younger brother. I can't think of his name. Okay, I'm sorry, this is going to bother me. I am so bad at names sometimes. This is why I do that little cheating thing I mentioned in names, because if I can remember a name, I'll remember it forever, but if I can't, I'm just an idiot. Oh, what is your younger brother's name, Vane? Larsa. Larsa Solidor. Sorry, okay, moving on. Larsa has to rescue her then and keep her safe in a political sense. Again, getting back to that theme I was talking about earlier. He has to rescue her from appearing like the circumstances were bad and then keeping her safe under those and blah, 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 blah. And I just think they could have done Penelo better. But other than these 2 points, I have one very big comment about Penelo, okay? You ready for this? Why is this person in the party? I'm sorry, we've had some rather superfluous characters in the past, but most of the previous Final Fantasies have gone out of their way to make these characters that otherwise seem like fluff to be actually relevant to the setting or have a deep personal interest in being there. Yuffie comes to mind immediately, someone who they developed extensively, especially in the extended works of Final Fantasy VII. And Kate Sith, of course, or Kachi, if you prefer. Another excellent example. They clearly had some ways of going with that. Even Mog in FF6, which I could write so many books about that damn game, but even Mog in FF6 did have a personal stake in things and a reason to be there. And yes, you could point to a few examples in the older games, usually optional characters and whatnot, as to why are they there. But none of those strike me as hard as Penelo does. Vaughn going forward with the party because he was skilled, and because he was strong-headed, and because he knew more about the circumstances of what was happening than was safe for any individual to know, and thus the party allowed him to continue with him because he was a liability rather than an asset. Makes perfect sense to me in character and lore. Penelo is a girl who gets kidnapped by someone who is barely related to anything, and then gets saved by Larsa, kind of almost literally by complete incident, by complete accident, and then joins the party. Even from a literary perspective, I cannot think of a reason why she was there. I really can't. Vaughn, like I said, was a good third-party perspective, but he actually had a very personal stake in what was happening. He had a personal connection to Gabranth, and he had a personal connection to Arcadia, and a personal connection to Bosch. What did Penelo have to anybody other than Vaughn? I mean, really, it seemed like it was Vaughn 0.5, basically. I'm sorry if I keep hashing on this, but this is one of the negatives of the game, in my opinion. If you're going to have a character, even a major character, even ignoring a party member, but if you're going to have a major character be a part of your story, make them have some relevance to it. Larsa, to use I hate to keep using him as an example, has so much more to do with the story and the plot and the setting than Penelo ever does. Why then make this character who is not major and not relevant a party member? I just don't get it. Let's move on. Let's see here. Balthier. I like Balthier. I like Balthier a lot, actually. He is my favorite character of this game, my favorite party member character of this game. Not just because I like the voice actor, and I have to give the man definite props. I meant to look up his name. You know what? I bet I could look that up right now. But I have to give the man definite props because he has a genuine subtlety to his performance more often than not. Every now and again you can tell he's just reading his lines, but for the most part, the man does actually put nuances into his performance, which I rather like. Gideon Emery, which is a name several people will probably recognize. He has done quite a bit of work in his career, and if I'm not mistaken, you'll have to give me just a moment here. I don't see it. Oh, duh, it's a different section. Apologies. Yep, there it is, Lorerunner. Anybody who's been playing WoW in the most recent expansion, and indeed in the most recent patch, knows that he has been playing Lorerunner. And in all honesty, his performance, his excellent performance of that voice, of the emotions and the nuances thereof, is one of the reasons I've gone from having basically no opinion of that individual to really rooting for him. And I'm not trying to drag WoW into this, I'm just trying to use this as an example of how good this voice actor is. I think it was a definite benefit to the game as a whole. He's played dozens of characters. I mean, look at all this. He's been in Dragon Age 2, Skyrim. I'm sorry, I'm getting way off topic. That is an important thing, though. Having a good voice actor doing a character like that was a huge benefit, because Balthier is the most complicated character, arguably, in the entire game, player or otherwise, and playable or otherwise. And he has so many layers to him. One of the things I like about characters is when they put up a layer, when they portray themselves as the mask, so that people assume it's a mask and try to look past that, and then they see the actual mask, the actual lie behind that. It's one of the things I enjoy. Locke in Final Fantasy VI did this, for example. Balthier does this as well, and he tends to portray himself as someone who he's all over the park, really. He tends to, sometimes he's like, oh, I'm a mercenary, sometimes he's like, oh, I'm a thief, sometimes he's like, oh, I'm a pirate. But through it all, he's just swapping masks out, and every now and again, he actually lets himself show. And everything you see there is someone who is bitter, and someone who is very well experienced, and someone who has been ground down by everything he's been through in his life over and over again, to the point where he's not even entirely sure why he keeps going at this point. He's basically on momentum. And he has a great deal of character development throughout the story. We find out a great deal about him and his past throughout the story, and I think his presentation was excellent. And one of the things I have argued, well, I should say debated, with people is who is the main character of Final Fantasy XII, and Balthier is one of the two people who I have had that debate with. And to be honest, I'm not actually sure. I'm not finalized on that. It is my automatic inclination towards another character, but I freely admit that a very strong argument can be given for Balthier. Excellent character, excellent presentation. Fran, I really liked as a character. I wish she'd put on some clothes, but whatever. I will actually give that a pass, and for a very specific reason. Fran was an excellent portrayal of an alien character. Now, obviously, she's not actually alien. She's a different species. But what I mean by that is too often, in fiction in general, aliens, whether different species or from another planet or whatever, are portrayed as basically human. Now, there's reasons for that. There's actually good reasons for that. Even someone who is a good writer will do that often on purpose, specifically to illustrate a certain literary point, and there's several ways to do that. But it is so rare to see someone portrayed as so fundamentally different from us, and they did an excellent job with that with Fran. She clearly was not a member of the same culture. She clearly did not think the same way we do, and I liked that. And that is why I give her outfit a pass, because while it's a little eye candy, and I'm sure that was the actual intent, nevertheless, what it does do is accent that this person is different, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I actually really like that. I really like that portrayal of Fran, and one of the reasons I rather cared for her as a character, especially when we do find out more about her past and go into her backstory. But anyways, and then of course we have Bosch. Bosch is a character I like because he is portrayed as someone who is simple, very black and white, very down to earth. But behind that, on several occasions, we see glimpses of someone who is very intelligent, who is very wise, who is very experienced, who knows things aren't black and white, and yet has made the deliberate and conscious choice to treat things as though they are, because that's what he believes in, because he either has to believe in something. He has to force himself to think this way, or else it's all just chaos, or because he does genuinely have some internal reason to have this thing to cling to, if you understand what I'm saying here. He wants so badly to believe in right and wrong, black and white, good and wrong, honor and dignity versus corruption and all that, and he sticks to the former with an almost zealous nature, with almost religious nature, I would say. And I think that's very excellently done, especially since he is portrayed again on many occasions as knowing, I shouldn't say knowing, as understanding, logically speaking, that that doesn't always apply. It's not 100%. Things aren't always black and white, but he clings to his belief nonetheless because he either has to, again, for the reasons I mentioned before, or because he genuinely believes that most of the time there is such a thing as good, and he likes to cling to that, and I like that. And then, of course, we get to the final character. Yes, this is the other character I've heard argued and debated as the main character of Final Fantasy XII, and this is the character I initially responded to when this discussion came up. Ashe. Ashelia Dalmascar, whatever the heck her name is. I can't remember the whole thing. Sid says it on several occasions. Ashe is a very amusing character to me, a very excellent character to me. I, again, wish she'd wear something a little bit more. If I wanted to, I could come up with an excuse for why she's wearing a miniskirt, but I'm pretty sure that one is just for sex appeal, so whatever. I don't care. I'm not going to make a fuss about it. I'm just commenting on it because one of the things I would have liked to see personally, if I was in charge of this, is Ashe either in something a lot more commoner like just plain old traveling clothes with a robe or something like that, very basic, or full suit of armor. But that is just me, and that is purely aesthetics. That's not a big deal, because everything else I have to say about Ashe is overwhelmingly positive. She was a brilliantly done character, in my opinion, and one of the reasons I posit that she is the main character is because she is the focal point of the entire story, in more ways than one. In the political domain, Dalmasca, and by extension her, or other her by extension Dalmasca, is literally the focal point of what is forming in a imperial war. Now, for those of you out there, very quickly, who don't know what I'm talking about, there is a difference between a country that decides to attack another country and an empire that decides to attack another empire. This kind of war is a bad thing, and just about everyone throughout the course of the game who has a brain recognizes this fact, recognizes that a war between Arcadia and Rosaria, as much as it is likely, as much as it is inevitable, is nevertheless something that should be avoided because of how catastrophic it will be, and indeed has been in the past. This isn't the first time they've been at war, and Dalmasca is literally at the center point of that because this is a political environment. Rosaria, in this kind of environment, Rosaria can't just say, well, we hate Arcadia, so we're going to declare war. It doesn't work that way. That would be committing political suicide. Whoever did that would probably lose their career and possibly their life. Arcadia can't do the same thing for the same reason. So there's a lot of back and forth, give and take, feint and counter feint in order to try and convince not only to not go to war, but to also go to war, to be ready in case they have an excuse to, because that's what it boils down to. And Dalmasca is 50 kinds of an excuse, and so is Ash herself. And Vane, especially, who I haven't talked about yet really, is portrayed as and shown as enough of a master strategist to understand fully how to organize this setup. And he specifically is the one pushing for war, and is basically the reason it happens, because he feels like he needs to unite things militarily. And in all honesty, speaking pragmatically and a little bit cynically, he's right. But I'll get to that later. This is about Ash. All of the political machinations of the entire game revolve around Ash. All of them really do. And ironically, so do all the metaphysical ones. I mentioned earlier that the political game, the story basically kind of stopped at a certain point, once you get to Giravegan, really. And after that point, it stops being this political story and starts being about the Ocuria, which are self-appointed gods who want to interfere with human nature and want her to take control with these incredibly powerful artifacts, to summarize for anyone who hasn't played the game, and go out and conquer the two empires and reunite humanity under her rule, and by extension their rule, because they believe they're the only ones who have the rights to do this. Now they're portrayed not necessarily as evil so much as people who should not be in power. And anyone out there who's seen a type of villain like this knows what I'm talking about. The Acuria are the true, actual villains of this piece, the ones who are really the bad guys behind everything else. And it really portray excellently, again, that alien philosophy, that alien portrayal, while at the same time just enough hints of neutrality and gray area to make you wonder. You know what I mean? But in all their interactions with Ash, her human reaction, her moral reaction, her emotional reaction, her logical reaction, and all of these are portrayed at different times throughout the game, to them and their manipulations gives us a full picture of exactly what these things are doing and whether or not it's a good or bad thing. And the general consensus is that it is a bad thing. That even in the midst of pragmatism, and the most darkest forms of cynicism and pragmatism, what they are doing is morally wrong. And it is in the end that which Ash decides to go for. And she goes through this journey throughout the entire game. She goes from a bitter, resentful, broken down, barely has anything to live for husk of hatred, to someone who chooses to spare the lives of her former enemies because she wants to end the cycle. If I might diverge for just a second, there is a magnificent episode of Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, called Duet. I recommend you watch it. I really do. If you have any, even the most remote interest, because while most of the episode seems so plain and so just so Star Trekky, it isn't until the last bit that the reality of what this episode is comes to light. I'll summarize it for you if you don't feel like going and watching it. An individual who was a Cardassian. If you don't know what a Cardassian is, just assume when I say Nazi, whenever I say Cardassian. I know that's a simplification. Let's not get into it, okay? He is a Cardassian, and he was not directly responsible for, but worked in a concentration camp for Bajorans. He was racked with guilt to the point of insanity over what happened at that camp. The actor who portrays him, brilliant, brilliant actor, has an absolutely heart-wrenching scene where he starts sobbing because he remembers hearing the screams of the Bajorans in that camp. And so he goes through this whole thing to try and get himself punished and killed by posing as the guy actually in charge of that camp, okay? And for any of you out there who think this is familiar, it probably is because it's based on an actual short story about a Nazi situation, which I'm not going to go into right now. But anyways, the reason I think that episode is, well, there's a lot of reasons why I think that episode is awesome, but the reason I bring it up in this relation is because overall, the episode was ultimately about that cycle of violence. One of the things I've heard before, and I've said this myself, is that at a certain point, vengeance isn't justice. The two blur quite a bit. But at a certain point, all you're doing, if I might quote, is adding another body to the pile. At some point in time, all you are doing is committing an atrocity yourself because another atrocity was committed previously, either to you or to your people or to someone else, which will prompt the other person to commit an atrocity in return. And you see where this is going. And this is something that happens in everyday real life often and has for a long time. It is a brutal cycle of violence. And I admit, I'm actually getting a little touched up here. This is one of my favorite scenes of FF12, when Ash, again with Vaughn's help, as I mentioned earlier, with the outside perspective and with everything that is going through the whole game, finally decides of her own volition to break this cycle, at least for herself, and do her best to break the cycle for others, because this cycle has been going on, as we hear through and we only get this through background. We only get this through the hunts and through the little setting tidbits and all the little talks about the past, that this cycle has been going on for a long time. And it's been going back and forth. Occasionally there's a couple generations in between the next reiteration, but it has been going on for a long time. And that is actually why the Okuria are stepping in, trying to force her to lay down, okay, no more. But she chooses the other path, that is to say, taking it upon herself to put down her weapon, which is a very dangerous and risky thing, and did almost fail. Let's be honest with ourselves. But I did like the fact that it succeeded, and I like the culmination of her character throughout this arc, throughout the whole of the game, because her character arc literally starts from the moment you see her at the wedding with Rossler, way at the beginning, literally before you are playing the game. It's in CGI right at the intro, all the way towards the second to last dungeon, the end of the second to last dungeon, right before, the point of no return where you start the last dungeon. Very excellently done. And I also like the fact, again, as I hinted at earlier, that her change of heart, so to speak, was not just oh my god, this thing is blue, I should go, and, it wasn't so immediate. Human beings, living beings, sentient beings, are not so simple, for the most part, to just suddenly have something happen and everything changes. And I usually find it a little cheap, not always, but I usually find it cheap whenever they do that in fiction, where one event happens and, oh, duh. No, no, no. What happened to Ash happened over the course of a long time, and it was lots of events, lots of interactions with people across the whole gamut. She interacted with horrible, evil, screwed up, messed up judges, and members of her own government, and people who were sympathetic but had to still play the political game. She interacted with people who were kind and helpful. She interacted with religious figures. She interacted with children and civilians and soldiers and political figures on the of the enemy that were nevertheless sympathetic and wanted to help her and help her kingdom. She interacted with so many different people, saw so many different perspectives, and slowly crawled her way out of that husk. Very slowly crawled her way out of that husk, to the point where she was a person again. And as the person, she then made her choice towards the end. And that's what I like about Final Fantasy XII. Now, let's talk about my last few points, because I do this in all my Final Fantasy reviews, except 10-2, because it's not a Final Fantasy. The music of FF12 is good. It has a problem, and I gotta put this in quote-unquotes, because whether or not this is a good or bad thing literally depends on the individual. Most Final Fantasy music, especially the stuff done by Nobuo Uematsu, is stuff that I like listening to. There have been times when I've been doing these reviews where I've had one of his songs, or one of the songs of the game I'm reviewing, playing in the headphones here while I'm doing this, because, awesome, yes, because I like listening to it. Some games, I mentioned this about Mass Effect 1 as well, have music that is ambiance, basically. It's environmental. It is meant to be background. It is meant to accent. It is meant to add to it. It's not elevator music, but it is there in order to, basically, as another feature of the background, Final Fantasy XII does that significantly, and very well, I might add. You genuinely get a feel for the area you're in based on the music that's playing, and I think it was very well done. So, I sound like I'm being negative here because I personally only actually listened to two songs from FF12 on their own. In case anyone's curious, that would be the Esper boss theme and Seeking Power, which is the song that plays when you're going to from the religious site whose name escapes me towards the temple whose name escapes me through the icy area. I'm sorry, names aren't with me right now. Those two songs I do love a great deal, but I cannot put this as a negative because the overall it's the same thing I was talking about the CGI earlier. The music in this game does accent the setting, the story, the specific scene, and does so excellently. And so definite props to them, especially since they were going orchestral, which was a reasonably new idea in video games in general, and something that is often very risky to do, especially because not everyone likes the sound of orchestral music, or indeed the sound of artificial electronic music. So there you go. Now, Vayne Solidor is an excellent villain, in my opinion. And one of the reasons why is while he is without question evil, he is extremely. He is the sort of misguided evil that you don't actually see done well all that often, in my opinion. He is someone who genuinely believes in the cause that he is championing. And ironically enough, he is actually right, as I mentioned earlier. I don't agree with his methods. I don't. But it is hard to argue with his point. He is trying to free humanity. What he was doing was not conquering the world. What he was doing was not, I will rule everything. No, he was trying to free humanity from the Ocuria. And as a secondary note, as a pragmatist and as a cynicist, he believed that only someone who was intelligent and skilled at the political machinations that so pervade this entire world, that only someone who was so good at that could lead that new society into its next era, which would be him. And he was right for an extent. Now, I don't think I'm sorry. He wasn't right in that he was the only one who could, but he was right in that he was someone who could have been a good leader for that under different circumstances. He was still definitely the villain, make no mistake, and he wasn't actually sympathetic as some villains are. He was simply very intelligent and knew what he was doing a lot more than it seems. And I have to give props to that, because all the way up until his dying scene, that was pervasive throughout him. But I do have to mention a couple other things with regards to Vayne Solidor. One of the things I'm very big on in any form of fiction is showing, not telling. Don't say, you know, let's use a really basic example, okay? This is a really dumb example, but bear with me. I gotta pull the camera up so I can see what I'm doing. Okay. This is a flashlight, right? Now I could say this flashlight, shines a reasonably bright light here, and I could tell you, it's going to do this light, and it's going to go for quite a ways, and it's going to be very lit up, and it's make a nice little circle and all that. All these things I could describe and tell you, okay? But unless I ever actually show you it, A, you're taking me on my word. I could be making this up, and B, you get less out of it, and it takes more time too. It's usually done as a form of padding. And top of that, it's also done in writing. This is a bad example for what I'm talking about specifically, but for example, it is too easy to portray someone as a military genius by saying they're a military genius. It is much harder as a writer to write someone do things that are militarily brilliant, because most writers don't know military tactics well enough to do that. You understand where I'm going with this? Or instead I could just do this. You see how bright this is? I was talking about this? Literally, I don't even have to say anything. 3 seconds and you understand everything that I was trying to communicate about this flashlight earlier. Now, what they did with Vayne, rather than say he is a brilliant politician and an excellent manipulator, they could have done that. That's the sort of thing fiction has done before with villains and with other people. What they did instead was actually show him politically manipulating, actually show him playing the game that he plays so well, and actually succeeding at it. And my favorite example of that by far, and I remember this distinctly, I'll never forget this, the very first time we fired up this game, my friend and I, when it first came out. We were up a long time that night. We were at the midnight release. He gives a speech to the citizens of Rabanastre, who are part of the Kingdom of Dalmasca, because he has just been sent as their Regent Lord. God, I always have that problem. Regent Lord. And this is also something he manipulated, although we don't find out that out until later. But he gives a speech. Now, it would have been too easy as a writer to instead have him start the speech, people of Rabanastre, and then it cuts to, say, Vaughn. Just bear with me on this. It cuts to Vaughn, and Vaughn is running through the area trying to steal something, maybe. Or maybe he's talking with Benello, something, and he just has an interaction so that the camera, if you follow me, the viewpoint is on Vaughn for this, and then it reaches the point where Vaughn finally gets to the speech he's giving, to the assembly he has, and then he sees all the people cheering for him, and he's just bowing amicably. You see what the writer does there? He gets across the point that Vane is an excellent manipulator in his wordplay, without having to actually write it. Instead, what these writers did was actually showed us his speech, which was brilliant. Anybody out there who knows anything about politics or manipulation through societal expectation and cultural perception, which I unfortunately know a good deal about, although I don't like going into that, but whatever, knows just how brilliant that speech was. I get the feeling they actually brought in someone separate specifically to write that speech because it was spot on. He started out with people booing and cussing and well, not literally cussing, but shouting vulgarities, screw you, and ended with them cheering, which is what would have happened because of the way he just played them like a fiddle. And he did it so quietly and so expertly that it was ridiculous. And that was a brilliant way to show us who Vane Celador was in one fell swoop. And he never stopped being that, too. He never stopped portraying that sheer competence at playing the political game. And in a game and in a setting and in a story that is so immersed with that political theme, as I was talking about earlier, having a villain who is better at it than anyone else really, really worked well. And the only reason, in the end, that the good guys won is because they stopped being political, walked up and punched him, basically, if you follow what I'm saying. Well, that's a crude way of putting it. That is literally the way it is from a story perspective. That is what happened. They walked up and said, okay, no, and actually performed literal power against him rather than trying to match him politically because they'd been trying that for quite a while and failing. Brilliantly done, and I do rather enjoy his death scene. Even though, well, not his death scene, actually, because his death scene was kind of pathetic. The scene right before the last boss, the finale there. I thought that was actually rather well executed. Because there's a lot of symbolism in it. The whole Bahamut thing, the whole partial Ocuria thing, and the idea of basically the fact that nothing is going to stop his death now, and in his last moments he's just going to lash out at whatever happens to take his hatred, that kind of thing. One of the things that most people don't understand about the concept of the one-winged angel form, not literally the one-winged angel within the case of Sephiroth, but that type of concept that's been true in video games for a long time, especially fantasy RPGs. The whole point is that, the question's often asked, why don't they just do that earlier? The reason is because when they have gone sufficiently far, when they have lost everything about them, when they go into that one-winged angel form, they're not revealing what they really are. I mean, obviously sometimes they are, but in general, they're not revealing what they really are. What they are doing is giving up. You see where I'm going with this? When you have reached that point, all you have left is the petty vengeance of killing the people in front of you. All your schemes are gone. All your plans are gone. Whatever it was you were after, gone. Your long-term goals, no more. All you have left is the petty vengeance of taking out these people while you still can, because it's often implied and often stated directly that once you go into the one-winged angel form, it's over. And for many different reasons. That's why that form is so powerful. That's why it tends to be used for the last boss, because literally the villain at this point is done. They have lost. The only thing left at this point is for them to try and kill you too. This is explicit with Vane and with Vana, the Ocuria, who is with him. They are dying. They are going to die. It's over. But in their last moments, they want to kill you before they go. And it is worth noting that things wouldn't have turned out nearly as well if the party hadn't survived. For example, the enforced peace between Arcadia and Dalmasca probably wouldn't have happened, and war probably would have happened, blah, blah, blah. So props to that. But my point is that it was very well done symbolically by showing that type of thing literally and directly, as well as metaphysically. That being said, the last boss was kind of a joke. Let's just be honest. I actually found that's been such a trend in Final Fantasy for so long. The last boss being a joke, basically since Final Fantasy VI and on, as much as I hate to admit it. And it was a joke in Final Fantasy XII too. I don't have anything else to say about that, so moving on. Overall, Final Fantasy XII is a game I enjoy greatly, even to this day. Obviously, I did play it quite recently. Obviously, now I pardon me just a second. I have been asked by several people if I am going to review Final Fantasy 13 or 13-2. I don't have a good way of explaining why it is I am not going to. Obviously, my answer is no. That no, I am not going to, and I'm having a hard time explaining why. But the ultimate response is going to be all of these ruminations, all these reviews I do are about things that I either know well enough, well, that I know well enough to do an actual dissertation on, and have enough enthusiasm about doing, if you follow me. And all of them, by a rule, for some time now, for over a year now, have to be a net positive. I'm just mentioning that as an aside. I'm not saying FF13 is a net negative. I'm just saying that that is something that has been a rule of mine, because I did used to do reviews of games that I didn't care for, because, I don't know, that's what other people did. I have since taken down all those reviews, because, no, that's not my thing anymore. It really never was my thing, and that's kind of why those reviews sucked, was because I was like, well, this sucks, and, yeah, anyways. But I want to be enthusiastic, and it's hard for me to be enthusiastic unless it's something I really care about and really have strong feelings about, whether positive or negative. FF13 is not on that list. It's a everything I could say about FF13 I could summarize so quickly and easily. It is very aesthetically pleasing. It is very graphically impressive. The combat system I don't care for, but I understand where they went with it. I understand why they did the mechanic of health and everything being reset after every combat, because that allows a certain level of tactics within each combat, and it allows them to be more site-specific with the difficulty of every single individual mob and boss. You know, stuff like that. I could go into that sort of thing, but ultimately that review would be like 5 minutes long, maybe 10 at the most, because there's so little for me to say because I got nothing. The story was there. It was competent, a little bit cliche, a little bit predictable. I'd already guessed all the big hints long before it actually were revealed. I got nothing. And 13.2, I was more favorable towards 13.2 until 13.3 started getting announced. And I don't want to, again, I don't want to sound too negative about 13.2, but something is taken away from the work, in my opinion, when you disjoint it so severely from the thing it is a sequel of. 10.2 was at least very clearly and decisively within Spira and dealing with the same characters as Final Fantasy X. You actually go to similar locations. In fact, that's one of the things they did, was they reused locations, both to help with the production time and to show the fact that you're in the same place, right? I'm with that. 13.2 13.2 felt too weird for weird's sake. Felt like it was trying too far to be something different, that they were trying too hard to go in a different direction with it. And 13.3 is doing that even more. And I don't want to go too much into these. This isn't the topic of this. But overall, I don't have enough good things to say. I'm not saying I'm saying bad things. I just don't have enough good things to say, and I have no enthusiasm for the games. I think that's the best way I can explain it. So I will not be reviewing 13 or 13.2 or 13.3. And I know a lot of people tend to ask if I'll review this or that. For anyone who is curious and has actually followed on this thing, I got the list right here. The next things I'll be reviewing, in order, are Half-Life, Half-Life 2, Civilization 5, Morrowind, Neverwinter Nights 2, and Metal Gear Solid 3. And, of course, I'll be continuing my Void reviews on my D&D blog. And I have rambled for way too long, so I'm going to go ahead and stop talking like this. Okay, anyways. Have a good one, guys.